So this video is called What We Believe Influences Our Interpretation of Scientific Evidence. I think this issue is omitted from being mentioned to most science students. The education establishment wants to just teach the theories it believes in and omit getting onto the issue that the scientific evidence can be interpreted by different theories to what it teaches. This issue is known as underdetermination, when evidence is insufficient to distinguish between different theories. Sometimes evidence is sufficient to distinguish between certain proposed theories, but it can often happen that evidence can fit different theories. I found a good book dealing with this issue though. And here's the book. It's by Brian L. Silver. There's some things in the book which I disagree with. For instance, it doesn't emphasise sufficiently the importance of Boskowicz's theory, but overall it is fairly good. So let's get on to it. This is what Silver has as one of his chapters, Belief in Action. Silver says the following: do our beliefs affect our work? ? To what extent do metaphysical reflections, religious faith, or scientific dogma influence the science, as distinct from the weekend thoughts of scientists ? It would be nice to think that nothing would influence scientists' search but the objective facts. Reality often says otherwise. Scientists are part of the society to which they live, and it is natural to look for the part their environment plays in their professional lives and the effect it has on their motivations and the way in which they see nature. At one time, that environment included philosophy. So I'm noting that means scientists don't go by objective facts. As Silver points out, it would be nice to believe the scientists went by objective facts, but they don't. There are other influences on them. Silver talks of Pythagoras, but what Pythagoras and his followers believed, not really relevant. So that Silver then goes on to say, although science and philosophy drifted apart during the 16th and 17th centuries, they have never stopped interacting, and there have been several periods in the last 3 centuries when science has deeply affected social and philosophical thinking. We have already seen an outstanding example of science in the shape of Newton and determinism infecting philosophy. Newton had this idea of a clockwork universe, i.e. the universe ran like a clock. Silver goes on to say, the influence of man's beliefs on his scientific activities have been less direct. The religious beliefs of Newton and Boyle strongly influenced the way they thought of man and the universe, but as far as their science was concerned, philosophy and mysticism were confined to their archimerical pursuits. Although they saw their science as the means to reveal God's creation, nevertheless, their physics is physics. What is true is that their motivation sprang partly and perhaps predominantly from irrational sources. And I would note on that, it was probably seen rational to them. So we have a split now between people's viewpoints as to what they would deem rational versus irrational, i.e. what Newton thought was rational, Silver wants to think as irrational. And people have different ways of looking at that, of what is rational versus irrational. So Silver carries on to say, what can be loosely termed irrational motivation is far more common than the non-scientist might suspect, and it is well documented that philosophical considerations that bordered on mysticism were never very far from the minds of several of the leading scientific figures of the early 19th century. Can we discern an overt influence on their scientific results? Can you distinguish an airplane built by an atheist from one built by a believer? My point on that is, well, they would talk about things differently from their different viewpoints. Silver carries on. How can results of science, based as they were on observation, depend on the convictions of the observer? The decline in religious faith over the centuries has not blunted the edge of this question, because in considering the effect of belief on the scientist, we have to include not only conventional religious faith, but also, and far more important in modern times, the belief in existing scientific dogma. For while there is perhaps a separation between the professional life of most scientists and their formal religion, there are other kinds of faith besides the belief in a supreme being. And what I note there is he admits to scientists have dogma. They have their belief about science, and that is their dogma. Silver gives an example. Galileo initially refused to accept the elliptical orbits that Kepler proposed for the planets, for the ancient circles were perfect forms, and Galileo in this instance was trapped inside a medieval mindset. And what happens is the circle at this time were thought perfect motion, and Galileo was still wanting to believe that. So Galileo was not immune to believing in a dogma. I think fortunately though he changed his mind and accepted what Kepler was saying. Silver carries on. The problem is general. We tend to see what we expect to see, and those expectations can be governed by accepted scientific theory, by philosophical convictions, or by religious beliefs. Preconditioning of the mind affects scientists no less than other men, although the present day scientist is by the nature of things more susceptible in his professional work to the compulsions that arise from existing scientific theory than to the promoting of philosophy or religion. So I'm noting that he's mentioning preconditioning, and that's what you get from the education system that the scientist undergoes, and where they're made to think in a certain way. Silver then goes on to point out the scientist has to have faith in believing his science. Silver does talk long about this issue, but the points I want raised have now been made. Given some scientific evidence, the scientists want to interpret that evidence in the way they have been preconditioned to think. Thank you. That's the end of this little talk.